Welcome back. Now, on the back end of the apartheid regime in 1994, the new national government was faced with a myriad of socio-economic gaps to fill. But despite the economic tailwinds that have been made, challenges such as corruption, a high unemployment rate, and scrambling state-owned enterprises continue to hinder that growth considerably. And joining us now to delve deeper into the landscape of the South African economy 30 years on, our political economist Moeletsi Mbeki and independent economist and columnist Duma Gqubule. Thank you so much for your time, gentlemen. Yeah, so there was this transition from the apartheid economy to the democratic economy. And my first question to you, Moeletsi, is were there enough measures made to ensure that the foundation was laid for the economy to thrive under the new political landscape?
Well, the answer is no. The new ANC government was so keen to demonstrate its pro-West, pro-capitalist credentials that they found an economy that had been closed to the world, and so was quite backward in many ways. Its industry was backward. I know, for example, IBM had imposed sanctions on South Africa. So the use of computers in the South African economy had fallen way behind what was happening in many parts of the world. But the ANC just opened up the economy to outside competition, and that wiped out, for example, our clothing and textile industry. It wiped out our footwear industry. It wiped out many other sections of the economy. So that really, there was no preparation. If you compare, China was faced with the same problem, by the way. It had a closed economy during the period of Mao Zedong, and they decided to open the economy. Because the Chinese economy, in terms of technology, management, and all, had fallen way behind the West. So they wanted to modernize the Chinese economy. But instead of destroying the industries that they had, inefficient though they were, but they were employing people. So they opened special economic zones, which initially couldn't compete against the Chinese industry. They had to export. That was point number one. Point number two, they had to train the Chinese managers, engineers, and so on. And then gradually they were allowed to sell to the Chinese market. But by then, the Chinese had learned from the Western companies, and they had set up their own companies to compete against the Western companies. Nothing of the sort happened here. These guys just said, oh, we now have discovered Washington Consensus. We used to be friends of the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union is no longer there. So we must prove to the West that we are not communists. So we open up the economy, and of course our economy was shredded by competition, especially from Asia.
I mean, this conversation is starting off really well because you're giving me some gems here, things that I didn't know, and obviously things that I can dig, deeper into. And actually with that, Duma, let's talk about the pie. Was the pie significantly shrunk because now obviously there are certain industries that are being wiped out, there's more competition, it's pro-West. Does this mean now that the pie just was not big enough to accommodate the broader economic participation that we got after 1994?
You know, Zinati, the problem, so whichever way you slice the data, we've had 30 wasted years of ANC misrule. If you summarize GDP per capita, it's an imperfect measure of average living standards, a country's ultimate bottom line. From 1994 to 2022, it increased by 22%. So by comparison, in China, 783%, in Vietnam, 337%, in Ethiopia, 315%, in India, 285%, and in Poland, 216%. So our economy over the 30 years, we are now we've got the highest unemployment rate in the world. Djibouti is number 2. We've got the second highest youth unemployment rate in the world. Djibouti is number 1. So 11.7 million people unemployed, 41.2% unemployment. Half the population lives in poverty. 1 in 5 don't have inadequate access to food. We are the most unequal country in terms of income, in terms of wealth. In terms of income, 10% of the population takes 67% of income. In terms of wealth, 10% of the population takes 87% of wealth. And so whichever way you look at it, we've got an unviable country. There is no plan by the government to get us out of this crisis. So if I just want to add lastly, from 2007 to 2023, we've had GDP per capita is lower than it was in 2007. That's 16 years. It is forecast to not increase for another 3 years. You saw the IMF, 1% this year, another year. So by the end of 2026, we will have had 19 years of no growth in GDP per capita. Something has to change, and we can't continue repeating these failed economic policies that Moeletsi is talking about and expecting a different result here.
I'm going to come back to the unemployment issue and the demographic shifts that we are seeing in Africa as a whole. But I want to go back to the fact that, the economic composition changed, right? And we're in a situation where the primary and secondary sectors had to give way to the tertiary sector. Is that a bad thing, Moeletsi?
Well, it depends.
Yeah.
That's the answer.
Yeah.
Our primary sector was a big employer.
Yes.
The mining sector.
Yeah.
And given the level of skills of the African population, that was important. Secondly, the mining sector in particular was employing people from the former homelands. So the former homelands where there is no employment creation, at least the people were living off the remittances from the brothers and the husbands who were working in the mining sector. As the mining sector shrinks, so the people in the former homelands have nothing to eat or have very little to eat. So the shrinkage of the primary sector is not necessarily a good thing in a mineral-based economy like the South African economy.
Yeah. Duma, I want to go back to, you mentioned unemployment, that we have one of the highest unemployment rates.
The highest, not one.
The
highest.
And that is significant. That is significant.
Yeah.
We have this demographic shift where we're now in Africa, there's a lot of youth, right? And it's seen as a demographic dividend. But then obviously we have this issue in South Africa where the biggest unemployment rate stands in the youth.
Yes.
How do we navigate that?
The unemployment rate of the youth, 67%.
Yeah.
That is just unacceptable.
So how do we take advantage then of that?
Because you have to provide the young people with access to education.
Yeah.
You have to keep them in school for longer than they are. And then you have to provide them with access to skills. And then obviously it's the basics of economic development. So, but the point is, in terms of unemployment, like according to my projections until 2035, we're going to see, the maths of unemployment, people must understand. There's a labor force growth rate of about 2.4% a year. That is just below the pre-COVID average. Yeah. So if you project it to 2035, 800,000 people are going to enter the labor force every year until 2035. And there is no plan for us to address that issue. We have to have a GDP growth rate of 4.2% just to create jobs for the 800,000 people every year. And this year we're growing at 1%. So on top of that, we have to create, to achieve full employment, 1.6 million jobs every year until 2035. So what I'm saying, it's an election year this year.
Yeah.
And what I've seen from all the political parties, they're not understanding the scale of this economic crisis, the scale of this unemployment crisis, and what they're offering is quite frankly uninspiring. it's different versions of what the ANC has been providing and has failed. They're just saying that we will do that without corruption, the same policies that failed, and we'll do it with more competent people. And rightly, the electorate is not inspired by that kind of message. We need a fundamental change in the structure of our economy. And all these countries that succeeded in Asia, that Moeletsi we're talking about, we've had premature industrialization as a country. So we should be growing the middle, which is the labor. Industry. So what we've had is, as you say, the growth of the tertiary industries, financialization, excessive financialization, and all that. So we have to change the structure. There has to be a fundamental change in the structure of the economy.
I'm going to end off with you, Moeletsi, but I have one more question for each of you. And I actually want to know, because obviously, as we're trying to grow this economy, there have been shocks. Global financial crisis, COVID-19. Do you think that even with the global financial crisis, we just didn't build enough so that we could withstand further shocks in the economy?
So President Cyril Ramaphosa, he gives the excuse of COVID. So if you look at the different presidents since 1994, Cyril Ramaphosa's performance is the worst. Average GDP growth rate of 0.5%, 6 wasted years from 2018 to 2023. If you take out the COVID, 2 years of lockdowns, we have 1.1% GDP growth, the lowest of any president since 1994. And the economy, in case we've forgotten, was collapsing before the pandemic, and the recovery from the pandemic is one of the slowest in the world. We had 0.5% GDP growth last year, 1% this year. The average emerging market grows about 4% a year, on average over a long period. So what we've had a really shocking performance under the 6th administration.
All right, just to close off the conversation, and of course, this is also tied to the economics. Moeletsi, what does the government that takes the reins in 2024, even if it is some sort of a coalition, a mixture, what do they need to prioritize in stimulating significant progress in economic growth?
Well, they have to prioritize privatizing Eskom, privatizing Transnet. Without that solution, our economy will be stuck where it is stuck. And they also have to create a new education system where there are no dropouts, so that a child who starts in grade R completes high school. Nobody drops out between them. But the education has to have higher technical component in the education.
I hear you. There's so many, we could talk for an hour. There's so many things that we need to unpack, but thank you so much for those ideas. And of course, I'm sure we will be having you back as we head to elections on what needs to be done. Thank you so much for your time, gents. That was Independent Economist Duma Gqubule and political economist Moeletsi Mbeki.